Under the flickering lights of a small-town auction barn, a lame horse limped into silence. No hand was raised to claim her, no bidder cared, until one man noticed something hidden beneath her worn saddle. What he found was not just a torn piece of leather, but the first whisper of a truth buried for years, a secret that would change his life and the town's forever. The heat in late August clung to the old barn like a stubborn shadow. Dust swirled in shafts of light pouring through cracks in the wooden planks, drifting down in slow spirals as if time itself had slowed. A ceiling fan groaned overhead, its lazy blades moving more air than cooling it. Rows of folding chairs filled the hall, occupied by ranchers in faded hats, denim jackets, and boots worn thin by years of work on stubborn soil. The air smelled of pine shavings and horse sweat, mixed with the faint sweetness of hay stored too long. Beneath it all lingered the scent of rusted iron. Metal gates and hinges that had witnessed decades of livestock traded, fortunes lost, and hopes bartered. A hush hung in the barn, not the hush of reverence, but the kind that came when people agreed without words that this part wasn't worth their attention. The auctioneer, Jack Miller, a man whose voice usually cracked like a whip through the crowd, stood with his clipboard pressed against his stomach. He cleared his throat, but didn't bother raising his voice this time. He didn't need to. Everyone could see the next horse brought in was no prize. She entered limping, her right front leg dragging just slightly, but enough to draw winces from a few sympathetic eyes. A dark bay mare, thin but not starved, her ribs hinting beneath the dull sheen of her coat. Across her forehead ran a blaze, narrow and white, like a flicker of lightning frozen into hair. Her ears twitched back and forth, restless, as she glanced at the crowd with eyes too calm for her condition. Eyes that spoke of something older than pain. The murmurs rose and died quickly. Some men leaned back, shaking their heads before Jack even opened his mouth. Others looked down at their boots, unwilling to meet the animal's gaze. "Lot number 27, Jack announced, voice low but steady. Dark bay mare. Not young, not sound, but still got some heart left. No one moved. The only sound was the shuffle of boots against the sawdust floor and the faint thud of the mare's uneven hooves. From the back row, a man lifted his head. Daniel Carter hadn't intended to come inside the barn. He had been standing in the doorway, letting the dim light frame the scene like a stage he wasn't ready to step onto. But something about the way the mare paused, as if reading the room, made him walk in farther than he meant to. Daniel was a man carved from loss. His hair had gone gray too early, his frame lean and wiry, the muscles of a man who had never stopped working even when the work stopped paying. A denim shirt tucked into worn, jeans, boots scuffed at the toes. His hat, sun-bleached and bent at the brim, once belonged to his father, and he wore it as though it kept him upright. The crowd knew him, of course. In towns like this, everyone knew everyone. They knew Daniel had taught English at the high school once upon a time. They knew his wife had passed 5 winters ago. They knew his daughter, Emily, had vanished one night without goodbye, leaving only silence in her wake. And they knew Daniel had never quite returned from that silence. Now he stood still as stone, watching the mare limp forward. Something flickered inside him. A spark, faint but undeniable. She reminded him of the way he walked into each morning, not gracefully, not quickly, but with a stubborn will that refused to yield. Jack tried again. Opening bid, $100. Anybody? His words fell flat in the dusty air. Silence. A woman in the corner shifted uncomfortably, brushing invisible crumbs from her skirt. Two men leaned close to murmur about fuel prices, as though the mare didn't exist at all. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He told himself it was sympathy. Nothing more. But then the mare lifted her head, nostrils flaring, and for the briefest second her gaze locked with his. It was not pleading. It was not broken. It was something else. Something that asked if he still had enough courage left to see. His throat worked. Dry and tight. He thought of Emily. He thought of the summer afternoons when she'd ride bareback by the Yellowstone River, laughing so freely the world seemed lighter for it. He thought of her blue ribbon tied in her hair, whipping against her cheek as she urged her pony forward. And now, standing before him, a horse with a limp carried a blaze across her forehead like a fragile flame refusing to die. 50? Jack tried, lowering the bar. Still no hands. The mare blew a sharp breath, pawed once at the floor with her good leg, then stilled again, patient in her waiting. Daniel's hand twitched at his side. He clenched it into a fist, nails digging into his palm. He wasn't here to buy. He wasn't here for anything. But the silence pressed on him, heavier than the Montana summer, heavier than all the years he had spent in his empty house. He didn't raise his hand. Not yet. But he didn't look away either. Outside, the sky dimmed into bronze as the sun slipped lower, and the barn seemed to hold its breath. The mare shifted, and for the first time, Daniel stepped forward, boots crunching in the sawdust. The sound drew eyes. A few whispered his name. The auctioneer paused, startled. Daniel reached the edge of the pen and rested one hand against the rail. The mare turned her head toward him, ears flicking, body tense, but not fearful. The connection hung in the air, quiet, fragile, undeniable. Jack cleared his throat again, a slow grin forming. Well, folks, looks like we might have ourselves a bidder after all. Daniel didn't answer. He just kept his eyes on the mare. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like a burden. It felt like the beginning of something he couldn't yet name. Daniel Carter didn't sleep that night. The sound of the ceiling fan creaking above his head mixed with the echoes of hooves from the auction barn. Every time he closed his eyes, the mare's gaze returned. Steady, calm, and unflinching, as though she had reached inside him and found the part he'd buried under years of silence. Morning light spilled through the thin curtains of his farmhouse, pale and gray like a reluctant promise. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that had weight. It had been like that for years, ever since Emily's laughter had stopped bouncing off these walls, ever since Anna's voice, soft but certain, had faded into memory. What remained was an echo chamber of absence. The coffee pot hissed, filling the air with the bitter scent of ground beans, a smell Daniel both relied on and resented. It was the taste of routine, without purpose. The farmhouse bore its scars in plain sight. Picture frames collecting dust on shelves, a hallway lined with books she never finished, the porch swing that creaked in the wind, though no one sat there anymore. On the kitchen wall, a faded calendar still hung, frozen on the month Emily had disappeared, as if time had refused to turn the page. Daniel moved through the rooms with the heaviness of a man who had stopped expecting answers. He had taught poetry once, lines of Whitman and Frost, words that had promised students there was beauty in the world if they only knew where to look. Now he couldn't even bring himself to open the worn volumes stacked on his nightstand. Literature had been his lifeline. Now it felt like a language spoken in a land he no longer lived in. Outside, the fields stretched dry and brittle, stalks of grass swaying under a wind that carried dust more than freshness. This land had once been alive for him. He had taught Emily how to plant tomato vines along the fence, how to ride along the ridge at sunset, how to listen to the earth instead of forcing it. Now, he could hardly look at the ridge without feeling the hollowness inside his chest. Neighbors had learned not to ask questions. They nodded at him in the grocery store, tipped their hats, but never lingered. Everyone knew loss when they saw it, and everyone respected its boundaries. In small towns across Montana, privacy wasn't just valued, it was sacred, and grief was the kind of privacy no one dared intrude upon. But what haunted Daniel most wasn't the silence of others. It was his own silence. Nights when he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from him, wondering if he could have done something different. Days when he walked by Emily's old room and stopped himself from opening the door, because he knew the sight of her unmade bed and the notebook on her desk would split him in two. The mare's limp, the way she carried herself with patience instead of shame, mirrored his own gait through life. She had entered that auction ring with her head high, even as the world dismissed her. And in that dismissal, Daniel had seen himself. The teacher turned laborer, the father turned ghost of a man, the one who had been left behind. As he poured his coffee, the steam fogged his glasses, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir, a fragile thread of possibility. Not hope, not yet. Hope was too dangerous, but perhaps the sense that not everything was finished, that the story wasn't as closed as he had forced himself to believe. He sat at the table, mug in hand, staring out the window at the old barn on his property. It had stood empty for too long, home only to pigeons and dust. He wondered what it would mean to bring the mare there, to give her shelter, to give himself the burden of care again. The thought frightened him as much as it steadied him. Responsibility was a sharp blade. Once you picked it up, you could never hold it lightly. The radio in the corner buzzed with morning news. Grain prices were rising, gas costs were unpredictable, and insurance companies were advertising affordable life insurance for families, as if loss could be softened by paperwork. He turned it off. None of it mattered here, not when the house itself felt like it was waiting for something to break the stillness. Daniel leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He could still hear the faint shuffle of hooves in sawdust, the pause before the mare's eyes met his, the way she didn't beg, didn't flinch. She had simply stood there, asking without words if he was ready to carry a truth he had avoided for too long. The cup trembled in his hands. He set it down and pressed his palms flat against the table, grounding himself. For years, he had thought survival meant not feeling anything at all. But last night had shown him otherwise. Survival was recognizing when something still stirred inside you, even if it hurt. By late afternoon, Daniel found himself driving past the auction barn again. He told himself it was habit, a coincidence, but he knew better. The lot was nearly empty, most of the animals already taken away in trailers. Dust rose in pale clouds as trucks pulled out one by one. He slowed his pickup, scanning the yard, and there she was. The mare, standing tied to a post, her head lowered, but her body steady. No one had claimed her. He pulled over, his chest tight. The auctioneer Jack stood nearby, clipboard under his arm, talking to a ranch hand. When he saw Daniel, his expression shifted. "Back again, Carter?" Jack asked, walking closer. "Didn't peg you for second thoughts." Daniel's voice was quiet, nearly swallowed by the wind. "What's going to happen to her?" Jack shrugged. "Hard to say. Might end up on a truck out east. Might sit a while. You know how it goes." His tone was casual, but Daniel heard the finality in it. The mare lifted her head then, ears pricking toward him. For the second time in 2 days, their eyes met. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground uncertain, the air sharp. Daniel swallowed hard. He had nothing left to lose. Or maybe, he realized with a shiver, he had one last chance not to lose everything. And that was the moment the decision began to form. Fragile, but unshakable, in the quiet heart of a man who had already lost the world once. The mare's hooves echoed softly against the wooden floor of Daniel's barn as evening fell. He had finally signed the papers with Jack Miller, though the transaction felt less like a purchase and more like a surrender to something larger than himself. Now the animal stood inside a stall that hadn't been used in years, her breathing steady, eyes following every movement he made. Daniel leaned on the rail, unsure what to do with his hands. It had been decades since he had cared for a horse. Back then, it was Emily who had begged him to teach her, insisting on saddling her pony on her own. He remembered the way her small hands had tugged on the leather straps, her laugh bubbling whenever he corrected her. That memory pressed against him now, sharp and sweet, and he let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Grace, that was the name he had chosen, shifted her weight, her limp obvious even in the stillness. He had meant the name as a quiet prayer, though he wasn't sure who he was praying to anymore. She nosed the stall door, then lowered her head as if in concession. Daniel stepped closer, offering his hand. She sniffed once, then pulled away. Not rejection, exactly. More like hesitation. The saddle she had arrived with sat on a wooden bench in the corner, its leather cracked, edges frayed, and stirrup straps worn thin. He couldn't bring himself to throw it aside. Something about it tugged at him, the way an old book draws you to open its pages even when you know the ending. He ran a hand across the worn seat, feeling the indentations where years of riders had pressed down. It was then that he noticed it, the uneven stitching along the underside. At first glance, it looked like a repair, but the thread was different, newer than the rest. He turned the saddle over, his fingers tracing the seam. With a slow tug, he pried it open, and something shifted inside. A small cloth pouch, no bigger than his palm, tumbled into his hand. His breath caught. The pouch was tied with faded ribbon, blue once, now almost gray. His chest tightened as recognition hit him like a sudden gust of wind. He had seen this ribbon before, tied around Emily's hair on the morning of her last school recital. She had worn it proudly, the bow slipping sideways as she rushed to hug him before running off stage. His knees weakened. He sat down hard on the wooden bench, the pouch trembling in his hands. For a long moment, he didn't open it. The air around him seemed to hum, alive with the sound of Grace, shifting in her stall, as though she too knew what was inside. When he finally loosened the ribbon, a small notebook slipped out. Its cover was scuffed, corners bent, pages yellowed by time. Written across the front in handwriting he knew as intimately as his own was a single word: Emily. The barn seemed to fade away. He flipped the first page and saw her handwriting, round, uneven letters pressed hard into the paper. If I ever disappear, trust Grace. The words blurred as his vision swam. He closed the notebook, pressing it against his chest, as if he could pull her voice through the paper and into his heart. Grace let out a low nicker, soft but insistent, and he turned his head toward her. She stood still, her eyes fixed on him, ears tilted forward. "Did she leave you with this?" His voice cracked, rasping in the shadows. The mare blinked once, then lowered her head as though answering. He pressed his palms against his face, the notebook warm in his hands. For years he had begged for any sign, any hint that Emily was still out there, that her absence wasn't the end of everything. And now, here it was, tucked beneath the saddle of a horse everyone else had dismissed as worthless. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of dry grass and distant rain. Daniel rose, his legs unsteady, but his resolve beginning to take root. He placed the notebook carefully on the workbench and untied the rest of the pouch. Inside lay a scrap of cloth embroidered with flowers, delicate stitches that could only have been Emily's. He remembered the summer she had sat on the porch, teaching herself to embroider because, as she had declared, poetry needs pictures too. A sound escaped his throat, half laugh, half sob. He leaned against the wall, gripping the pouch like it might vanish if he let go. Grace shifted again, stamping her good leg once, and Daniel crossed the stall to her. This time, when he held out his hand, she didn't pull back. Instead, she leaned forward, pressing her soft muzzle against his palm. The touch was light, fleeting, but it was enough to anchor him. "I don't know what you carried for her," he whispered, "but you carried it here. To me." Her ears flicked, and for the first time he felt something beyond grief. Something fragile, something like the first crack of light under a locked door. He stayed with her until the barn grew dark, oil lamp casting golden halos on the walls. When he finally left, the notebook tucked safely inside his jacket, he knew the silence of his house would no longer be the same. It was no longer empty. It held a question, a path, and the faintest echo of his daughter's voice. The next morning broke with a sky the color of pewter, clouds hanging low over the Yellowstone Valley. Daniel stepped outside with the notebook pressed close to his chest. The cool air smelled faintly of sagebrush and rain, carrying the kind of stillness that always seemed to arrive before a storm. He had not slept. His mind had replayed the words scrawled in Emily's handwriting again and again until dawn. "If I ever disappear, trust Grace." The barn door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the mare lifted her head, ears flicking at the sound of his boots crunching against the straw. For a moment, she simply regarded him, eyes dark and steady, as if she had been waiting all along. Daniel hesitated, then spoke the name softly, testing it on his tongue. "Grace." The word carried through the dust-filled air like a prayer. The mare shifted, her tail swishing once. She didn't come forward, but she didn't turn away either. Daniel tried again, louder this time, his voice trembling but firmer. "Grace." She snorted lightly and stepped toward him, limping but unashamed. The sound of her uneven hooves echoed in the barn, a rhythm that matched the uneven beat of his own heart. Daniel extended his hand. She lowered her head, and this time touched his palm with her muzzle. The contact was brief, but in that moment, Daniel felt as though the years of silence around him had cracked open, letting a sliver of light pour in. He set the notebook gently on a hay bale, then turned back to her. Her coat was dull, patches rough where rain and neglect had worn her down. He fetched a brush from an old tack box, its wooden handle scarred from use. When he began to stroke along her neck, she tensed, muscles shivering beneath her skin. "It's all right," he murmured, voice low and steady, like he used to speak to Emily when she was a child afraid of storms. "You're home now." Little by little, Grace relaxed. Her breathing steadied, the rise and fall of her ribs matching the rhythm of the brush. Daniel's movements slowed, each stroke carrying the weight of memory. He remembered standing behind Emily on summer afternoons, watching her groom her pony with the same patience, humming songs off-key. He had thought those days would last forever. When he finished, Grace turned her head slightly and rested her muzzle against his shoulder. The warmth of her breath soaked through the fabric of his shirt. Daniel closed his eyes, swallowing hard against the knot rising in his throat. He wanted to believe this was trust, not just a weary animal leaning for support. He wanted to believe she was carrying Emily's message not only in a notebook, but in her very being. The storm finally broke that afternoon. Rain hammered against the roof, rattling the tin until the whole barn seemed alive with noise. Daniel stayed inside with Grace, oil lamp flickering against the walls, casting their shadows together in long, wavering lines. He spoke to her in broken sentences, words he had not said aloud in years. "I thought I lost everything when Emily left," he admitted, voice nearly drowned by the rain. "But maybe she left a part of herself with you." Grace blinked slowly, head lowering as if in acknowledgement. Daniel reached out and touched the blaze on her forehead. The narrow white streak shaped like a flame. It glowed under the lamplight, a beacon in the dark storm. Hours passed. When the rain eased, Daniel led her outside to the corral. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, and the mountains in the distance glistened under a thin veil of mist. Grace limped along beside him, but her pace was steady, her head held high despite the awkwardness of her gait. Daniel leaned against the fence, watching her explore the mud-softened ground. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, an urge not to retreat, but to move forward. Not for himself, for her, for Emily, for whatever truth waited on the other side of this fragile connection. When evening fell, he returned her to the stall, spreading fresh hay beneath her. She settled with a sigh, lowering herself into the straw. Daniel lingered, the notebook heavy in his jacket pocket. He wanted to read more, to know what else Emily had left him, but he also knew some truths could not be rushed. "Grace," he whispered again before leaving. The mare lifted her head, eyes glinting in the dim light. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the weight of his name spoken back to him, not in words, but in the trust of an animal who had every reason to turn away. As he closed the barn door behind him, the valley lay quiet under a sky washed clean by rain. Daniel breathed deeply, the scent of sage sharp and alive. He knew the road ahead would be long, uncertain, but he also knew this: he was no longer walking it alone. The morning sun crept over the Bridger Mountains, spilling gold across the valley. Mist curled low in the hollows, dissolving slowly as light warmed the fields. Daniel stood by the corral fence with the notebook in his hands, the faded ribbon tucked carefully between the pages. Grace grazed nearby, head low, tail swishing against the last of the mosquitoes. Her limp was still there, sharp and obvious, yet she moved with a dignity that made Daniel's throat tighten every time he watched her. He had promised himself he wouldn't open the notebook again too soon. The first words had been enough to keep him awake for nights, but promises like that dissolve under the weight of loneliness. The stillness of his farmhouse was too heavy, too thick with ghosts, and so he carried the notebook outside, to the place where the air smelled of dew and pine. Sitting on the fence rail, Daniel untied the ribbon once more. His fingers trembled as he opened to the second page. Emily's handwriting leapt at him, round and certain in some lines, shaky in others, as though she had written them in haste. Dad, I don't know if you'll ever find this. I don't know if Grace will ever carry it back to you. But I needed a place to put the words I couldn't say out loud. Daniel's breath caught. He leaned forward, elbows pressed to his knees, reading as if the page itself were breathing. Sometimes I feel like the world is too heavy. People smile, but their eyes don't. I keep hearing things I'm not supposed to hear, whispers at the edge of town. I want to run, but I don't know where. Grace is the only one who listens without asking questions. The ink smudged in places, as if a tear had fallen and blurred the words. Daniel's hand pressed hard against the paper, trying to steady himself. He remembered Emily's eyes at 13, full of defiance and mischief, and then later at 17, distant, shadowed. He had convinced himself it was just adolescence, that every young woman needed her own secrets. Now he saw how wrong he had been. Grace lifted her head then, ears twitching toward him, as though she sensed his unraveling. Daniel glanced up. Their eyes met, and for the second time that week, he felt as though Emily were standing there too, speaking through the mare's steady gaze. He turned the page. A river helps me breathe. When I'm by the Yellowstone, I feel like I can let go of the noise. Grace likes it too. She walks into the water without fear, even when the current pulls. Sometimes I think if I could follow that river far enough, it would carry me somewhere safe. Daniel closed his eyes. He remembered those summer days vividly. The riverbank scattered with smooth stones, the smell of cottonwood leaves baking in the sun, Emily's laughter as she splashed into the shallows with bare feet. He remembered warning her not to go too deep, and the way she would roll her eyes before obeying, pretending to be annoyed. The memory pressed against him like a weight and a gift at once. His hand shook as he turned another page. This time there were no full sentences, just fragments. He was there again at the fair. He always watches. I can't say his name. No one would believe me. Grace knows when I'm scared. She stands in front of me, like a wall. The words ended there, the page torn where it seemed more had once been. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He clutched the notebook to his chest and inhaled sharply. The air smelled of horses, wet earth, and something sharper. The metallic taste of dread that settled on his tongue. He closed the notebook with care, tying the ribbon once more. He could feel his own breath shaking as he slid it into his jacket pocket. Standing, he leaned against the fence, watching Grace. She chewed calmly, flicking her tail, as if the world's heaviness didn't belong to her. "You kept her safe," he whispered, voice hoarse. "At least for a while." Grace turned her head at the sound, and for a fleeting second, Daniel thought she understood. That afternoon, Daniel walked into town. The streets were alive with ordinary sounds. The clang of the diner's door, children calling as they rode their bikes, a radio blaring country music from an open window. Yet Daniel moved through it like a ghost, the words from the notebook echoing in his skull. He was there again at the fair. At the hardware store, men leaned against the counter, discussing interest rates on farm loans and the rising cost of feed. Insurance posters hung on the walls. Protect your family's future. Affordable life insurance for farmers. The slogans made Daniel feel hollow. How could paper promises guard against shadows that lived inside a child's eyes? He left quickly, the bell above the door clanging too loud. As dusk fell, Daniel returned to the corral. Grace stood by the fence, her blaze catching the last of the light like a torch. He rested his hands on the rails, watching her. The unease coiled in his chest, pressing harder than before, but beneath it was something else, too. Resolve. He had lived years in silence, letting grief carve him hollow. But Emily's words had survived, hidden and carried by a horse no one wanted. Now those words were in his hands, and the silence was no longer an option. "Grace," he said into the twilight, the name settling on the air like a vow. "We'll follow this trail together, wherever it leads." The mare pawed once at the ground, her ears pricked forward. Daniel felt the weight of memory pressing down, but he also felt something rise within him, a fragile but undeniable will to uncover what Emily had left unsaid. The night closed in around them, stars blooming slowly above the valley. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel abandoned beneath their light. He felt chosen. The morning after reading Emily's words, Daniel walked into town with the weight of the notebook pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat. The streets of Livingston were calm, paved in the rhythm of routine. Shop windows gleamed with harvest decorations, pumpkins stacked beside bales of straw, banners advertising the upcoming county fair. Yet beneath the brightness, there was something subdued, something that hummed in the pauses between greetings. At the diner, the bell over the door jingled as he stepped inside. Conversations halted for a second too long, like a skipped breath. Then they resumed, lighter, forced. The waitress, a woman who had once taught Sunday school alongside Anna, smiled politely but didn't ask how he'd been. She placed a coffee cup in front of him and retreated as though distance itself were a kindness. Daniel stirred the dark liquid, watching the swirl of cream dissolve, and listened. The men at the corner booth spoke in low voices about drought insurance, about government subsidies for hay, about a neighbor who had sold his land rather than risk another lean winter. Their words buzzed with practicality, but behind them Daniel heard something else. Avoidance. He knew the sound of people steering away from what truly haunted them. When the bell rang again, Sarah Collins entered. She carried her vet's bag slung over one shoulder, her braid damp from morning rain. Spotting Daniel, she offered a nod, hesitant but genuine, then ordered to go. Before leaving, she paused at his booth. "How's the mare?" she asked. Hesitated. He hadn't spoken Emily's name aloud to anyone in years. He didn't now, but he felt the weight of her letters pressing against him. "She's steady," he managed. Sarah's eyes softened. She always had a calmness to her, even when she was younger. She almost said more, then caught herself. "If you need medicine for the limp, come by the clinic." Her words lingered after she left, a subtle reminder that Grace's history wasn't a secret to everyone. Daniel finished his coffee in silence, the notebook burning against his chest like a hidden flame. As he walked back through town, he noticed things he hadn't before. The way two ranch hands stopped talking when he passed, how the clerk at the feed store avoided his eyes. It wasn't cruelty. It was fear, or guilt, or both. And suddenly, Emily's words in the notebook, "I can't say his name, no one would believe me," felt stitched into the fabric of the town itself. That afternoon, Daniel visited the library, a building with stone steps worn smooth by decades of boots. Inside, dust floated in the sunlight like drifting pollen. The librarian, an elderly man who had once been Daniel's student, looked up with surprise. "It's been a while, Mr. Carter." Daniel nodded, his gaze drawn to the bulletin board near the entrance. flyers layered one over another. Church potlucks, life insurance seminars, ads for solar panel financing. The surface of small-town life looked busy, modern even, but Daniel sensed what lay beneath it. The same silence that had swallowed his daughter. He checked out nothing, just stood among the shelves until the smell of old paper made his chest ache. Emily had spent hours here, curled in a chair with novels too advanced for her age, her face lit with a hunger for stories. She had once told him, "Books don't lie, Dad. People do." The memory chased him out into the evening air. The sun sank low, casting long shadows across Main Street. A boy pedaled past on a bike, laughing, his dog racing alongside. The sound should have been ordinary. Instead, it struck Daniel like an echo of what he had lost. When he reached home, Grace was waiting at the fence line, her head lifted, ears pricked. She seemed to know he carried more than groceries. She seemed to sense the weight of unspoken things. Daniel approached slowly, letting his hand rest on the rail. "I saw it today," he told her quietly. "The way they won't look at me, the way they avoid her name. They all know something. They've known all along." Grace snorted softly, stepping closer, her blaze catching the last of the daylight. Daniel let his hand slide along her neck. Her warmth steadied him, grounding him against the swell of anger and sorrow that threatened to undo him. That night, in the stillness of the farmhouse, he opened the notebook again. The next page carried only a single line, jagged and hurried. "If I vanish, follow the whispers. They will lead you to the truth." Daniel stared at the words until they blurred. He could hear the whispers already, in every pause, in every averted glance in town. Emily had left him not just a clue, but a challenge. To listen. To pry apart the silence that had buried her story. He closed the notebook gently, placed it on the table, and looked out the window toward the barn, where Grace stood like a sentinel against the night. His daughter's voice had crossed years of absence to reach him. Now, it was his turn to follow. The banners went up along Main Street a week before the fair. Bright cloth in red, white, and blue snapped in the wind, strung between light poles that hadn't held much joy in years. For most of the town, the annual summer fair was an anchor, proof that life still circled back to celebration, no matter how hard the winters had been. For Daniel, the fair was a wound. He hadn't walked its aisles since the night Emily vanished. On Saturday evening, he parked his truck at the edge of the dusty lot and sat for a long moment with the engine ticking in the cooling air. The smell of fried dough drifted across the field, sweet and heavy. Children's voices carried, laughter rising above the country music blaring from loudspeakers. He could have driven away. He almost did. But the notebook's last line haunted him. "Follow the whispers. They will lead you to the truth." He stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the dry earth, and walked toward the lights. The fair sprawled across the park, rides spinning with neon, food stalls dripping grease and sugar, the livestock pens lined with ribbons. Everything glowed with the false brightness of festivity. Daniel moved slowly, as if through a dream, his eyes catching every familiar corner. He passed the cotton candy stand where Emily once begged him for extra tickets. She had come away with pink sugar stuck to her cheeks, grinning like the world belonged to her. He saw the game stalls where she'd thrown darts at balloons, determined to win the smallest stuffed horse on the rack. He remembered her spinning in a white sundress, laughing as she danced to the fiddle music by the stage. But there had been a moment, quick, sharp, when her laughter had broken. He hadn't understood it then. Tonight, as he walked those same paths, the memory struck harder. Emily had tensed when someone stepped close. She had stiffened under a gaze Daniel had been too blind to notice. He carried that blindness like a stone in his gut now. Near the beer tent, he caught fragments of conversation. Two older men hunched over their cups, voices low. Thought she left with friends. Never came back, though, did she? Best not stir it up. They fell silent when they noticed him, their eyes sliding away. Daniel kept walking, but the words burned. Whispers, just as Emily had written. At the livestock ring, young riders paraded their horses. Parents cheered from the bleachers, cameras flashing. Daniel leaned against the rail, the smell of sawdust and manure thick in the air. A chestnut gelding circled past, his rider steady in the saddle. For a moment, Daniel imagined Emily among them again, her braid bouncing against her shoulders, her focus fierce. He had been proud that night, proud and blind. The fair swelled with noise, announcers calling winners, guitars twanging from the stage, generators humming beneath the lights. Yet in Daniel's mind, the night was split by silence. He remembered standing near the Ferris wheel years ago, watching the cars rise against the starlit sky. Emily had slipped away then. He had assumed she was with friends, safe in the familiar fold of the town. By the time he realized otherwise, the music had ended, and the whispers had begun. He walked toward the back of the grounds, where shadows gathered along the tree line. The crowd thinned here, the noise softened. His boots crunched over gravel, and the cool scent of pine replaced the haze of fried food. He stopped by the fence, gripping the wood until his knuckles whitened. This was where he'd last seen her. He could see it, as if it were happening again. The glow of carnival lights flickering against her face. The way she had glanced over her shoulder, uneasy, before disappearing into the darkness beyond the trees. Daniel had told himself for years that it was normal teenage restlessness. Tonight, with her words in his pocket, he knew better. The air pressed heavy around him, filled with ghosts of laughter and fear. He let out a breath that sounded like a broken prayer. "I'm here, Emily," he whispered. "I'm finally listening." Behind him, the fair roared on. People cheered, music flared, coins clinked against game boards. But Daniel stayed at the edge of the shadows, listening to the silence between the sounds, listening for the whispers his daughter had told him to follow. When he returned home that night, the fair's lights still burned behind his eyes. Grace lifted her head as he entered the barn, her breath warm in the cool air. Daniel leaned against her stall, pressing his forehead to the wood. "She tried to tell me," he murmured, "and I wasn't listening." Grace shifted closer, her muzzle brushing his arm. He turned, resting his hand against her blaze. The mare's steady gaze held him as firmly as the past. Somewhere in those pages, somewhere in the town's silence, Emily's truth waited. And now, at last, he was ready to walk into it. The storm broke just before dawn. Rain drummed against the farmhouse roof, sliding in rivulets down the windows and filling the air with the sharp scent of wet earth. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the notebook that lay open before him. The words on the page, Emily's fragments of fear, her warnings wrapped in silence, blurred in the dim light. His coffee had gone cold, but he hadn't touched it. He was waiting without realizing he was waiting. A knock at the door startled him. It was soft at first, then firmer. He rose slowly, every movement weighted by suspicion. Few people ever came by. When he opened the door, Michael Harris stood there, rain dripping from his hat, his face drawn in lines of unease. "Can I come in?" Michael asked. His voice was rough, hesitant. Daniel stepped aside without a word. Michael removed his hat, setting it on the counter, and stood for a long moment without speaking. He had once been Daniel's closest friend, a fellow teacher at the high school, someone who used to join his family for Sunday dinners. They hadn't spoken more than polite greetings in years. Finally, Michael sank into a chair, rubbing his hands together as though to warm them. "I should have come sooner," he said, staring at the floor. "A long time ago." Daniel folded his arms, the weight of silence pressing between them. Michael looked up, and in his eyes Daniel saw something raw. Shame, maybe, or a burden carried too long. "The night of the fair," he began, voice low. "I saw Emily." Daniel's breath caught. The rain outside seemed to fade, leaving only the hammering of his pulse. "You saw her?" Michael nodded. She wasn't alone. She was with Tom Reynolds. The name landed like a stone in Daniel's chest. Tom, wealthy rancher, respected, a man whose influence stretched across the county. He had been Daniel's neighbor, drinking buddy, the man who had offered help after Anna's funeral. "I thought—" Michael's hands shook as he tried to explain. "I thought it was nothing. She was 17, maybe just talking, but she looked different, uncomfortable, scared. I should have stepped in. I didn't." Daniel gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles whitening. "Why are you telling me this now?" Michael swallowed hard. "Because I can't keep carrying it. Every time I see you, it feels like I'm looking at my own cowardice. I knew you were searching for answers, and I kept quiet. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself Tom was too powerful to cross. But Emily, she deserved better than my silence." The words cracked open something inside Daniel, rage and sorrow twisting together. He wanted to shout, to strike, to demand why Michael had waited all these years. But instead, his voice came out as a whisper. "She wrote about it. In her notebook. She wrote she couldn't say his name. She was afraid no one would believe her." Michael flinched, his face crumpling. She was right. That's why I stayed quiet. I was afraid of losing my job, my land, afraid of what Tom could do. He pressed a trembling hand to his mouth. "I'm sorry, Daniel. God, I'm sorry." The apology rang hollow against the years of silence. Daniel turned away, staring out the window where rain streaked the glass. Grace stood in the corral beyond, her coat slick with water, head lowered against the storm. She was steady, enduring, as she always was. "You saw her that night," Daniel said, his voice low but steady now. "And you chose yourself over her." Michael didn't answer. He bowed his head, shame heavy in his silence. Daniel let the weight of the moment settle, the storm raging outside in rhythm with the storm inside him. He thought of Emily's words, "Follow the whispers." Michael's confession was no longer just a whisper. It was a voice, cracked with regret, pointing him toward the truth he had been too afraid to face. When Michael finally rose to leave, he looked smaller, diminished. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. "I just needed you to know." Daniel didn't reply. He watched as his old friend stepped into the rain and disappeared down the muddy road. Left alone, Daniel sank into a chair, his hands trembling against the notebook. He opened it again, tracing the lines of Emily's handwriting. Every word now felt heavier, as though her voice was pressing him forward. The truth was closer than it had ever been, but so was the danger of what it might reveal. He lifted his head and looked again at Grace through the rain-streaked window. She raised her head, too, ears pricked, as if she understood. Daniel whispered, almost to himself, "We're not done. Not yet." The storm eased by evening, leaving the valley drenched and shining. The sky cleared in streaks of silver light, and Daniel stepped outside to stand by the corral. Grace came to the fence, pressing her muzzle against his hand. Her touch was grounding, solid, reminding him that no matter how heavy the past, he was no longer walking it alone. The sky was a pale wash of blue when Daniel saddled up his truck the next morning, though he didn't drive far. He couldn't shake Michael's words, couldn't ignore the image of his daughter disappearing into the night with Tom Reynolds looming nearby. The name tasted bitter on his tongue now, like ash. Tom, pillar of the town, benefactor of the fair, the man people toasted with whiskey at Christmas suppers, the man Daniel had once called a friend. Daniel had seen Tom's ranch 1,000 times from the road. It spread across the valley like a kingdom, its fences stretching farther than the eye could follow, its barns painted fresh every spring. Today, he turned onto the gravel drive with his jaw clenched tight. The truck rattled as it climbed toward the white farmhouse, its porch lined with geraniums that spilled red against the wood. A picture of prosperity, respectability. Grace wasn't with him this time. She remained in the corral, her dark eyes following as he left, her muzzle pressed to the fence rail. He carried her strength with him, the way she had leaned into his hand the night before. But he knew this step was his alone. Tom sat on the porch, as if he had been waiting. A glass of amber whiskey rested in his hand, though the hour was barely past noon. He looked older than Daniel remembered, but no less sure of himself. His broad shoulders filled the chair, his silver hair combed neatly back. When he rose, it was with the measured pace of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Well, if it isn't Daniel Carter," Tom said, his voice rich with practiced charm. "Haven't seen you up here in a while. What brings you out?" Daniel didn't bother with pleasantries. He stepped onto the porch and set the notebook down on the small table between them. The ribbon fluttered in the breeze like a flag. Tom's eyes flicked to it, then back to Daniel. His smile didn't falter, but a shadow passed through his gaze. "You know what this is?" Daniel asked quietly. Tom took a slow sip of whiskey. "Looks like a child's diary. Something you've been holding on to?" Daniel leaned forward, his voice low, steady. "It's Emily's. And in it, she wrote about you." The silence that followed stretched tight, broken only by the chirp of crickets hidden in the grass. Tom set his glass down with deliberate care. His expression hardened, though the corners of his mouth still curved in that practiced half-smile. "Careful, Daniel," he said. "You toss words like that around in a town like ours, and they'll land heavier than you expect." Daniel's fists tightened at his sides. She was afraid no one would believe her. She was right. You made sure of that. Tom straightened, the weight of his presence filling the porch. "I've given this town more than anyone else. Jobs, land, fairs, donations. They know who I am. They trust me. Who do you think they'll believe? Me, or a broken man clinging to a horse and a notebook?" Daniel's chest burned, but he didn't flinch. "I don't care if they believe me. I care that they hear her. She's not gone, Tom. Her voice is here, and I won't let it stay buried." For the first time, Tom's smile slipped. It was a flicker, but Daniel saw it. The crack in the mask. The truth hid there, behind the arrogance, behind the whiskey. He pressed harder. "You were with her that night," Daniel said. "Michael saw you." Tom's jaw tightened. His glass tipped slightly in his hand before he set it down again. "Michael talks too much," he muttered. Then, louder, his voice regaining strength. "You should be careful which ghosts you chase, Daniel. Some doors are better left closed." The warning carried weight, but Daniel stood taller, finding in himself a strength he hadn't felt in years. "I've lived with silence long enough. I won't live with lies." They locked eyes, two men bound by years of history now split by a truth too heavy to ignore. The air between them hummed with unspoken threats. Finally, Tom leaned back in his chair, reclaiming his mask. "You won't get far with that notebook," he said softly. "This town knows where its bread is buttered, and it isn't on your table." Daniel picked up the notebook, tucking it against his chest. "Then I'll make sure they hear her outside of town, if I have to." For a moment, Tom said nothing. Then, he gave a thin, humorless smile. "You always were stubborn." Daniel turned without answering. As he walked back to his truck, the sun broke free from a cloud, washing the ranch in gold. But to Daniel, it felt cold, like light shining on something rotten. He drove home with the gravel spitting under his tires, his hands tight on the wheel. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from a clarity that left no room for retreat. He had looked Tom in the eye and seen the crack. He had pressed his daughter's voice into the air, and for the first time, he had seen the mask slip. When he reached his farm, Grace was waiting at the fence again. She lifted her head as his truck rolled in, ears pricked, as if asking what he had found. Daniel climbed out, walked straight to her, and pressed his forehead to hers. "He knows," Daniel whispered. "And he's afraid of the truth." Grace breathed out, a warm rush against his cheek. Daniel felt it like a vow. The silence was ending. The evening after Daniel faced Tom Reynolds, the valley lay under a heavy quiet. The sun slipped down behind the mountains, staining the horizon in bands of crimson and violet, while shadows stretched long over the dry fields. Daniel's truck sat parked by the barn, engine silent, dust still clinging to its frame from the long road back. He hadn't spoken a word since returning. Words felt like brittle things after the confrontation, too fragile to hold the weight of what he had seen in Tom's eyes. Instead, he walked straight to the barn. Grace lifted her head from the hay as he pushed the door open. The oil lamp flickered in his hand, throwing a trembling circle of light across the wooden walls. The mare's ears pricked forward, her eyes catching the glow. She shifted her weight, her limp showing as she stepped closer, a soft wicker escaping her throat. Daniel set the lamp on the shelf and leaned against the stall rail, exhaustion heavy in his bones. "I saw him," he said quietly. His voice sounded raw, as if scraped by gravel. "And I saw the truth hiding behind his smile." Grace lowered her head, pressing her muzzle against the wood between them. Daniel reached out, resting his hand against her blaze, the familiar streak of white warm beneath his palm. The contact steadied him. The anger that had burned in him all day softened into something else. Sorrow, yes, but also a kind of fragile relief. He wasn't chasing ghosts anymore. There was flesh. There was guilt. There was something Tom wanted buried. He slid the stall door open and stepped inside. Grace didn't move away. She stood still as he stroked her neck, the rhythm of his hand slower than the rhythm of his heart. Her breathing filled the barn, even and steady, as if she carried a calmness he had forgotten how to hold. Daniel sank onto the old wooden bench in the corner of the stall. The straw rustled as Grace shifted to stand beside him. Her body radiated heat, and the smell of hay and horseflesh filled the small space, grounding him. He rested his head against the rough boards and let his thoughts unravel. "I should have seen it," he whispered. "All those years ago, I should have seen what she was trying to tell me." His voice broke, but the mare only sighed, her breath ruffling his hair. The hours passed slowly. The lamp burned low, shadows dancing across the beams above. Daniel pulled the notebook from his jacket pocket and turned it over in his hands, the ribbon trailing like a thread of memory. He didn't open it. Tonight wasn't about searching for more pain. Tonight was about staying still long enough to feel the weight of what he already knew. At some point, he dozed, his head dropping forward, until the soft nudge of Grace's muzzle woke him. Her warm breath brushed against his cheek. He blinked, disoriented, then smiled faintly, the first true smile he had managed in years. "All right," he murmured. "I'm still here." He rose, joints aching, and brushed straw from his jeans. Grace shifted back, giving him room, but her gaze never left his. In her eyes he saw not pity, not judgment, but something simpler. Presence. A refusal to abandon him. Before leaving the stall, Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the rise and fall of her breath. "Whatever comes," he said, "we'll face it together." The words were more than comfort. They were a vow spoken into the night. Outside, the fields shimmered silver under the moonlight. The farmhouse loomed against the dark, its windows reflecting nothing but emptiness. But here, in the barn, the silence felt alive. Daniel blew out the lamp and lingered in the darkness, listening to Grace's steady breathing. It was the sound of endurance, of a heartbeat that hadn't given up. When he finally stepped into the night air, stars spread wide overhead, sharp against the black. Daniel drew in a breath that felt different. Fuller. Steadier. The confrontation with Tom had shaken him, but Grace had reminded him that brokenness did not mean defeat. He walked back toward the house with the notebook under his arm, and the warmth of the mare's presence still lingering against his skin. Behind him, Grace shifted in the straw, settling with a sigh, her dark outline framed by moonlight. Daniel paused at the door of his farmhouse and looked back. In that moment, he understood something he hadn't dared admit before. Grace wasn't just carrying Emily's secrets. She was carrying him, too, keeping him from collapsing under the weight of silence. And for the first time in many years, Daniel didn't feel entirely alone in the night. The days after his confrontation with Tom blurred together, each one stretched thin with unease. Daniel moved through them as if waiting for something, though he could not have said what. He mended fences, stacked wood, brushed Grace's coat until it shone despite her limp. But none of it dulled the feeling that the air around him had changed. It was as though a storm still brewed, not in the sky, but in the silence that followed him everywhere. One evening, the sun fell behind the ridge, and the house grew dim. Daniel lit a single lamp in the kitchen, its yellow glow soft against the walls. The notebook lay on the table, closed, though its weight filled the room like another presence. Grace shifted in the barn outside, her hooves crunching softly in the straw. He took comfort in the rhythm of her movements, steady, alive, unyielding. The phone rang. For a heartbeat, Daniel thought he'd imagined it. The sound was so foreign, so out of place, that it jolted him upright. The old rotary phone on the counter had gathered dust for years. No one called him. Not anymore. When the ring came again, sharp and insistent, it sent a tremor through him. His hand hovered above the receiver, afraid of what voice might wait. Finally, he lifted it. "Hello?" His voice cracked, hoarse with disuse. There was silence on the line. Not the emptiness of a broken call, but the kind of silence that trembles with someone holding their breath. Then, softly, a single word. "Dad." The world stilled. Daniel's knees buckled, and he gripped the edge of the counter to keep from falling. The voice was older, steadier, but unmistakable. "Emily." He pressed the receiver tighter against his ear, afraid it would vanish. "Emily?" The word broke from him like a prayer, like a wound opening. "I didn't know if I should call," she whispered. Her breath hitched on the line. "I didn't know if you'd even want to hear me." Daniel closed his eyes, the kitchen spinning. "I've wanted nothing else," he said. His voice was a rough whisper, raw with years of silence. "Every day, every night." There was a pause. He could hear her breathing. Fragile, but real. "I saw the notebook," he said quickly, afraid she might hang up. "Grace carried it back. I read your words." Emily exhaled sharply, like she'd been holding the truth in her chest for too long. "Then you know. You know why I left." "I know you were scared," Daniel said. His hand shook so hard the receiver rattled. "I know you thought no one would believe you, but I believe you, Emily. I believe every word." Her voice broke on the line. "I wanted to tell you so many times, but he had everyone. Everyone trusted him. I thought if I spoke, it would destroy you too." Daniel pressed his forehead against the wall, tears running freely now. "It destroyed me anyway," he whispered. "Not knowing, living in silence, but hearing you now." His throat closed, and he forced the words out. "It's enough to keep me breathing again." The line hummed softly, the sound of distance bridged by a fragile thread. Emily spoke again, her tone steadying. "Grace kept me safe, Dad. More times than you know. She was my shield. I left her behind because I knew she'd find her way back to you, to tell you I was still out here." Daniel looked out the window. In the barn, Grace moved in the shadows, lifting her head as if she sensed the call. He pressed the phone tighter, whispering, "She found me, and now you have too." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty this time. It was full of everything they had lost and everything that still bound them. "I can't come back yet," Emily said at last, her voice trembling but resolute. "It isn't safe. But I needed you to know I never forgot you, not for one day." Daniel's chest ached, but he smiled through the tears. "And I never stopped waiting, not for one day." There was a click, a rush of static, and then the line went dead. He stood in the kitchen, the receiver still clutched in his hand, the dial tone buzzing like a fading echo. Slowly, he set it down, his body trembling with exhaustion and wonder. The silence returned, but it was different now. No longer an enemy, but a companion carrying her voice inside it. Daniel stepped outside. The night air was cool, scented with sage and the faint sweetness of wet earth. Stars spread thick above the valley, sharp and clear. In the barn, Grace nickered softly as he approached. He laid his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. "She called," he whispered. His voice broke, but he kept speaking. "She called, Grace. She's alive." The mare breathed against him, warm and steady, as if sealing the truth with her presence. Daniel stood there a long time, tears drying on his cheeks, listening to the night and the heartbeat of the horse beside him. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like a promise. The night after the call passed in fragments of waking and dreaming. Daniel lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling while the old fan groaned above him. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard her voice again. Not the memory of her childhood laughter or the echo of her teenage defiance, but the sound that had filled his ear just hours ago. Low, trembling, undeniably real. Dad. That single word had undone years of silence. When dawn finally bled across the horizon, it felt different. The sky wasn't brighter than usual, yet every streak of gold seemed sharper, more alive. Daniel rose slowly, his joints stiff, his mind unsteady from the sleepless night. He splashed water on his face at the sink, the reflection staring back at him less hollow than it had been yesterday. The lines of grief were still carved deep, but beneath them was something new. A current, a flicker, a reason to keep breathing. Outside, the world was waking. The pasture glistened with dew, each blade of grass tipped in silver. Meadowlarks sang from the fence posts, their calls carrying across the valley. In the barn, Grace shifted and snorted, impatient for her morning. Daniel walked toward her, his boots damp from the grass, and for the first time in years, he felt like the ground was steady beneath him. Grace greeted him with a "nicker," pressing her head against the stall door as he slid it open. He brushed her slowly, each stroke a meditation. Her coat gleamed under the soft light, though her limp remained, stubborn and pronounced. Daniel no longer saw weakness in it. He saw resilience, the same kind that had carried Emily's words back to him. He spoke aloud as he worked, the habit new but already necessary. "She called," he told the mare, though he'd said it the night before. "She's out there, Grace. She's alive." Grace blinked slowly, as if she had known all along. After chores, Daniel sat on the porch with the notebook on his lap. The ribbon was tied neatly again, holding the pages closed. He didn't open it. For once, he didn't need to. Emily's voice was no longer just ink on paper. It was breath, alive on the other end of a phone line. That was enough to steady him, to let him sip his coffee without the bitterness drowning him. Still, unease gnawed at the edges of his hope. Emily hadn't said where she was. She hadn't promised to return. She had spoken of danger, of reasons she couldn't explain. The call had been a gift, but also a reminder. The story wasn't finished. Later that morning, Daniel drove into town for supplies. The streets bustled with ordinary life. School buses rumbling, shopkeepers sweeping sidewalks, a group of teenagers laughing as they passed. For years, Daniel had felt separate from all of it, a man marked by absence. But today, he felt tethered again, if only by a thread. At the feed store, conversation swirled around him. Crop insurance, rising fuel prices, talk of solar panels for barns. Beneath it all, Daniel listened for whispers. He caught a few, fragments spoken just low enough to sting. "Saw Carter at Reynolds's place. He's stirring up old ghosts. That mare, the one that limps, isn't she his girl's?" Daniel didn't flinch this time. He carried Emily's voice inside him like armor. Let them whisper. Every word proved the truth was pressing its way to the surface. By afternoon, the weather turned crisp, the wind carrying the scent of pine down from the mountains. Daniel worked with Grace in the corral, guiding her gently in slow circles. Her limp made the gait uneven, but she moved with determination, ears forward, eyes bright. He walked beside her, matching her pace, as though the two of them were learning to trust the same uneven rhythm. When she stumbled, he caught her lead rope, steadying her. "Easy," he murmured. "We'll get there." The words weren't just for her. As twilight came, Daniel returned to the porch. The sky flared orange, then softened into indigo. He lit the lamp inside, but left the door open, listening to the night sounds. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Emily was alive. That truth alone had shifted everything. Still, he knew Tom Reynolds wouldn't stay silent forever. The crack he had seen in Tom's mask was real, and men like Tom didn't tolerate cracks. Something was coming. Daniel felt it in the tightening of the town's glances, in the careful pauses of conversation. But tonight, as the stars brightened one by one, he let himself rest. Grace stood in the barn, steady and patient. The notebook lay closed on the table, ribbon tied like a promise. And Daniel, for the first time in years, leaned back in his chair and let himself breathe. The dawn had been fragile, yes, but it was dawn nonetheless. The morning after that fragile dawn, the wind carried a clean edge off the mountains, the kind that made the flags on Main Street snap like small, brave hearts. Daniel drove into town for nails and salt blocks, but mostly to test the air. He wanted to know if the silence he'd lived under was still the same shape. It wasn't. Not quite. At the diner, the bell over the door gave its usual bright jingle, and this time the conversations didn't stall so completely. The waitress set down coffee before he asked, and touched the rim of the cup with one careful finger. "On the house," she said, not looking long but not looking away either. The coffee tasted different, too, a little sweeter, as if someone had finally remembered the sugar. Ads flickered from the small TV over the counter, home insurance bundles, auto insurance discounts, a smiling agent promising protection like a warm roof. But for once, Daniel felt protected by something real, the way a few people chose to meet his eyes. On the corkboard by the register, new flyers overlapped old ones, yard sales, a church potluck schedule, a clinic offering low-cost legal consultations with an attorney driving in from Bozeman. He noticed a smaller sheet, tucked half-hidden behind a notice about mortgage rates, a helpline number for anyone who needs to talk. The paper edges fluttered when the door opened, as if the town itself were trying to speak. He carried a sack of feed to the truck and nearly bumped into Sarah Collins. She had hay chaff in her braid and mud up the back of her boots, the uniform of a vet with more barn calls than hours in a day. "I've got joint support and a mild anti-inflammatory that won't mask pain," she said without preamble. "If you want to keep her moving without pushing her too hard." "I do," he said. It was the easiest yes he'd given in years. Sarah glanced toward the road out to the Reynolds place, a quick cutting look that held and then vanished. "Town feels different today," she murmured, "like someone opened a window." "Or rattled one," Daniel said. Back at the farm, he found Michael Harris hammering a loose board on the west fence. No phone call, no asking permission, just a tool belt and an apology he had already given. Michael's swing with the hammer was steady, and in the pauses he left the kind of quiet that asked nothing in return. When they broke for water, he kept his eyes on the horizon. "I can talk to people," Michael said. "Not rumors. The truth. Small circles first." "You sure?" Daniel asked. "No," Michael said, mouth twisting. "But I'm done being silent." They didn't shake on it. Some vows are truer without ceremony. They returned to work, the thud of nails and the rasp of breath knitting the fence and the afternoon together. The shift showed up elsewhere in small ways. A bag of alfalfa left at the barn door with no note, a pie on the porch under a tea towel with blue violets, a text from a former student Daniel hadn't seen in a decade. "Thinking of you, Mr. Carter. If you need anything, I've got a truck and a free weekend." Even the feed store receipt had a handwritten line at the bottom. "Tell the mayor she's got fans." The town had begun to turn its face, not boldly, not loudly, but like a field of sunflowers seeking the light because they no longer could bear the shade. Grace felt it too. In the corral, her ears angled toward the road more often, then softened when Daniel came into view. They worked on a loose circle that wasn't quite a circle. 20 steps at the walk, a pause, then 20 more. When she faltered, he matched her, not urging past the limit, just standing still until her breath lengthened. Trust grew there, invisible, but measurable, like the way a river deepens without changing its song. He spoke to her less, touched her more, letting his hand rest under her jaw where the pulse thudded calm as a drum. "Looks good," Sarah said that evening, leaning on the fence rail. She had driven out after her clinic hours with a tub of supplements and a careful smile. Grace came close enough to fog Sarah's knuckles with warm breath. "She's putting weight where it counts. Keep the footing soft, mind the corners. And Daniel, call me if you notice heat." He nodded. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Sarah said. "Thank whoever taught you patience." "Emily," he said, and the name didn't break him this time. It steadied him, like another post sunk deep. Word moved the way it always does in small places, along church pews, across bleachers at junior rodeos, in half-sentences between the produce and the dairy aisle. Daniel noticed the angle of people's bodies changing when he entered a room. Not closed off, not open either, more like braced, as if expecting a gust. The bank manager looked up from behind the counter and nodded, a human gesture from a man known mostly for interest tables and credit card offers. The librarian cleared a chair beside the west window without being asked, leaving a stack of westerns and a memoir about trail riding where Daniel would find them. The sheriff's deputy, passing the diner, tipped 2 fingers from the brim of his hat and kept walking. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make the paper. But to a man who had lived under a dome of absence, it felt like weather breaking. Not every wind changed direction. Near sunset, a black pickup rolled slow past the Carter place and didn't turn its head. Daniel recognized the Reynolds brand on the door even without reading the letters. The truck idled by the mailbox long enough to make the air feel smaller, then continued on, casual as a yawn. Grace lifted her head, nostrils flaring. Daniel laid a palm on her neck. "Seen storms before," he said quietly. She settled, because he did. Sunday came with a sky like enamel and air that tasted of cut hay. At church, the hymns rose, threads of voices that had sung together through births, blizzards, funerals, and bumper crops. Daniel stood in the back pew, elbows loose at his sides, and felt rather than heard the wavering point at which harmony becomes courage. Afterward, nobody cornered him, but nobody avoided him either. Mrs. Benson squeezed his forearm with floury fingers, left a recipe card in his palm with nothing written on it but pies on your porch. Don't argue. The pastor folded a bulletin around a phone number for a counselor 2 towns over. Quiet help, the only kind that lasts. On Monday, the school sent a message asking if he might read a poem to the seniors during homecoming week. Something about endurance. He typed yes, then sat at the kitchen table a long time, the notebook beside his elbow like a second heart. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The words had already moved out of paper into air. Grace took the new days like she took everything, with attention. At dusk, Daniel led her out to the east pasture, where the ground sloped gentle, and the wind talked in the grass. They stood without moving. A deer ghosted the fence line, all tendon and shadow. A hawk rode the sky with slow wings. Sprinklers ticked somewhere far off, keeping time for people still betting on this land. When Grace leaned her shoulder closer, he leaned back, a counterweight to her patience. In town, window displays changed. Harvest wheat bundles tied with navy ribbons, a flyer for a visiting personal injury lawyer slid between ads for 4-H and calf roping, a new poster about planning ahead with life insurance pinned next to a blood drive. The commerce of protection, policies, papers, premiums, felt almost tender in its small way, yet Daniel knew what guarded him now couldn't be bought. It was the way 2 ranch hands stopped pretending not to see him and said, "Afternoon." The way Michael, at the co-op, spoke a sentence out loud and left it to stand. Some of us were wrong to be quiet. That night, wind rattled the cottonwoods and carried the smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's stove. Daniel wrote Emily's name on an index card and tucked it under the salt shaker. Not a shrine, not a talisman, just a place for the living syllables to rest. He walked to the barn with a lantern and found Grace dozing, hind foot cocked, lip soft. He didn't wake her. He stood and watched until the world slowed to the pace of her breath. The town had not chosen a side. Towns rarely do. It had simply begun to tip, and Senya, almost imperceptible lean toward listening. Maybe that was all anyone could ask. Maybe that was how truth made its way forward, not with verdicts, but with the quiet, repeated decision to face one another in daylight. Leaving the barn, Daniel paused at the door and looked back. "We keep walking," he said. The words felt like they belonged to both of them now. Grace flicked an ear. Somewhere beyond the dark ridge, a truck rumbled, a dog barked twice, and silence spread again. Wide, workable, like a field waiting for seed. He latched the door and stepped into the night with the sense, not certainty, not yet, of ground beginning to hold. The town was shifting. It might shift back. But for the first time in years, it was moving at all. The first frost came quietly, veiling the fields in silver. Daniel woke to see the world sharpened by cold, each blade of grass stiff as glass, each fence post crowned in white. He pulled on his old canvas jacket and stepped into air that smelled of pine smoke and frozen earth. His breath puffed in clouds as he crossed the yard toward the barn, where Grace was waiting. She moved stiffly that morning, her limp more pronounced against the brittle ground. Daniel opened the stall, brushing the frost from her mane with steady hands. "You don't hide it," he murmured. "You carry it like it's part of you." Her dark eyes met his, calm and unwavering, and he realized that what he had once pitied now looked like strength. The limp wasn't weakness. It was proof that she still moved forward, no matter what. They walked together into the corral. Daniel kept pace with her uneven rhythm, not pushing her into circles but matching her steps stride for stride. He found that his own body eased when he followed her lead. She paused when pain demanded it. He paused too. She advanced when ready. He advanced beside her. It was less training than a kind of prayer, a lesson whispered in movement instead of words. By midday, Sarah stopped by in her pickup. She carried supplements in a plain sack and a stethoscope slung around her neck. Watching Grace move, she nodded slowly. She's compensating well. Pain doesn't own her, Daniel. It's just part of her language. She looked at him, her voice softening. Maybe it's part of yours, too. Daniel didn't answer. But later, as he sat on the fence, he let the thought settle. All his years of silence, all his sorrow, they weren't things to be erased. They were his limp. And like Grace, he was still here, still breathing, still walking forward. That evening, Michael arrived with a thermos of coffee and a stiffness that wasn't from cold. "He's watching you," Michael said, meaning Tom Reynolds without naming him. "People talk. His men drove past my place twice this week. Slow, too slow." Daniel sipped the bitter coffee and nodded. "I figured as much. You don't seem worried." "I've already lost what mattered most," Daniel said simply. "He can't take it twice." Grace shifted closer to him then, brushing her shoulder against his arm. The gesture steadied him more than any shield could have. Word from town drifted in on the wind. A student at the high school had asked about Emily in class. A neighbor left a bag of apples by the gate. A pastor's sermon had lingered on the words, "The truth shall make you free," and half the congregation had looked Daniel's way. The silence of the town was cracking, and in the cracks, light was beginning to leak through. That night, Daniel led Grace to the old pasture where Emily had once ridden. The grass was short now, brittle under frost, but the memory of her laughter lingered in the air. He stood in the middle of the field, Grace at his side, and let himself imagine his daughter's voice rising over the hills. For the first time, it didn't hurt to imagine. It comforted him. As stars spread across the cold sky, he spoke aloud to the mare. "You were her protector when I failed to be, and now you're mine. Seems fitting, doesn't it?" Grace lowered her head, exhaling a plume of breath that glowed white in the starlight. Daniel placed his hand on her blaze, feeling the warmth beneath the frost. "We'll carry this together," he whispered. "Your limp, my silence. Neither of us walks straight, but we walk. That's enough." The frost bit at his fingers, but he didn't pull away. He stayed until the stars wheeled higher, until the ache in his chest settled into something steadier than pain. When he finally turned back toward the farmhouse, Grace followed, her limp steady, resolute. In the hush of the frozen night, Daniel understood the lesson his daughter had left him through this horse. Endurance was not the absence of wounds, but the decision to keep moving with them. And in that understanding, he felt the first trace of peace. Autumn deepened over the valley, painting the cottonwoods in gold and fire. The air turned crisp enough to carry wood smoke across miles, and the evenings came earlier, shadows stretching long across the Carter farm. Daniel rose each day with the same quiet ritual. Tend to Grace, check the fences, sip coffee on the porch while the mountains caught the first light. Yet inside him, the rhythm had shifted. The silence he once carried like a weight had become something else, a vessel full of memory and fragile hope. The call from Emily lingered in every corner of the house. He heard her voice when he set a plate on the table, when he walked past her old room, when he stood in the barn brushing Grace. She was out there, alive. He didn't know where, and he didn't know if she would ever come home, but he no longer lived in absence. He lived in connection. The town, too, had changed in small but permanent ways. At the diner, people greeted him without hesitation. At the feed store, the clerk handed him change with both hands, looking him in the eye. Sarah stopped by often, bringing small things, a bag of oats, a thermos of soup, and staying long enough to share a laugh that sounded like something normal. Michael kept working fences, shoulders straighter, as though speaking the truth had returned a piece of himself. The whispers hadn't disappeared, but they had softened, shifting from avoidance to acknowledgement. One evening, as frost crept back over the ground, Daniel lit a lantern in the barn and spread Emily's notebook on the workbench. He read it slowly, page by page, even the smudges and torn edges, as if each mark were her hand still moving across paper. When he finished, he didn't cry. Instead, he felt a calm he had never expected, a calm born of knowing that Emily's words had crossed years to reach him, that her truth was alive, even in fragments. Grace stood quietly beside him, her limp more pronounced in the cold, but her presence steady. Daniel rested a hand on her blaze, feeling the warmth of her skin under his palm. "You carried her," he whispered. "Now you carry me. And maybe that's how we both keep going." The mare exhaled softly, a plume of breath rising in the lantern glow like incense. Later that week, Daniel walked with Grace to the far pasture where Emily used to ride. The grass was short, brittle with frost, and the river shimmered beyond the ridge. He stopped in the middle of the field, the mountains rising dark against the evening sky, and let the silence stretch. Grace stood beside him, ears pricked as if listening too. "I don't know if she'll ever come back," Daniel said aloud, voice steady. "But I know she's still part of this world. That's enough." The stars began to appear one by one, sharp against the indigo sky. Daniel tilted his face upward, letting the cool air sting his lungs. He thought of Emily's laughter, of Anna's steady voice, of all the echoes that had shaped his life. They weren't gone. They lived in memory, in breath, in the way Grace leaned gently against his shoulder. When they turned back toward the house, Daniel moved in rhythm with Grace's uneven gait. Each limp, each pause was part of the journey, not an obstacle. He no longer wished the limp away, hers or his own. Brokenness was not the opposite of strength. It was the proof of survival. The farmhouse windows glowed warm as they approached, light spilling onto the frost-covered ground. Daniel opened the door and stepped inside, closing it gently behind him. He placed the notebook back on the table, the ribbon tied neatly, and let his hand rest on it one last time. Not an ending. A continuation. A voice carried forward. Outside, Grace settled into the barn with a sigh, her breath fogging in the cold. Inside, Daniel sat by the window, watching the valley sink into darkness. He felt no need to fill the silence. The silence itself was full, of memory, of promise, of love that had never died. The echo remained, and for the first time in years, it was enough. And that was Daniel's journey, with Grace, the lame horse no one wanted, who carried a truth no one dared to speak. If this story touched your heart, leave a simple comment below. Just type 0 if you felt the pain, or 1 if you still believe in hope. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next story may be the one that heals a part of you you never knew was broken.